like Deborah, I also prefer to stand. So this is the title of a paper that we published in the Asia Pacific Economic Review, or rather they published last year, which had an interesting genesis. It was actually commissioned by a Japanese organization, which probably tells you all you need to know. And they wanted us to look into the longer-term future of China-Africa relations, looking at it from both points of view, but particularly the changes taking place in China and what implications those would have for Africa, but also changes taking place in Africa and how these two might interact. Some of it I'll skip over because I think you're going to be dealing with it in greater detail later, so I've already given you the background to it. I'll talk a little bit about the current frame of China-Africa relations, which again I think you're going to deal with aspects of it later, and then really focus on China's economic rebalancing and what it means for Africa. So this will pick up on some of the themes that we developed in the first session and extend them a little bit, but also in some senses agree with a lot of the previous discussions. And then in the end we sketch some broader considerations or broader implications, particularly for China as it engages with Africa. Okay, so as I said, the genesis of the paper was to move or to take the discussion beyond the current frame. This was published last year, and of course a lot of analysis has been done since, but I think the basic framework of the paper is still valid. And then what we see as the key driver really is China's economic rebalancing, but also, of course, as we've just heard, in fact, a lot of the kinds of manufacturing investments that Deborah was talking about are really market-seeking investments, and that's to capture some of the Africa rising narrative. So there's certainly drivers on the African side, too. So I'll skip over politics and security. We'll deal with that a little bit in the paper. I'll just dwell a little bit on the economics. So if we think about the current China frame, what do we see? Well, how do you characterize China? So, of course, there's different definitions. We reach for a relatively easy one, which is the notion of state capitalism. And in a sense, the first thrusts of Chinese engagement with Africa have been about Chinese state capitalism engaging with African countries. And so what are the key features of that? State-owned enterprises, particularly in resource extraction, policy banks. Deborah showed us what's happened with the Exim Bank, for instance, and of course official development assistance backing all of that up. And that still obviously remains highly relevant, but as I'll hope to show you, it's becoming relatively less relevant. And then of course a lot of that's been about resources, resource extraction, shifting now into manufacturing, and I'll have more to say about that shortly. On the African side, that's raised quite a lot of concerns, actually, about deindustrialization. That's certainly a term one hears a lot. But that debate, I think, is shifting a little bit in light of some of the factors that Deborah was pointing to. And then again, the special economic zones, which partly are designed to address this deindustrialization concern, but of course they have a logic of their own as well. And I'll skip over these two slides. So it's basically, this was just to capture the core elements of the China-Africa frame. And some of it becomes relevant towards the end of the presentation. Now, what's going on in China? So how are things changing? Well, there's lots of different opinions about this. So basically, 5 key bullets. We all know about the increased domestic cost structure, and it's not just wages, it's land, it's electricity prices, it's a whole range of costs that are going up. So the China price has changed, or it's in the process of changing, one should say, because China still has a lot of advantages in low-wage, assembly-based manufacturing, a lot of that now moving into the interior. There are also big concerns. We saw this now when the Paris conference started up. The pollution levels in Beijing were astronomical, so concerns over resource-based industrialization, what that's doing to the Chinese environment, which is why China now seems to be coming to the party in Paris. There are major problems in the Chinese financial sector. I think we all know that. The extent of the problems I don't think anybody knows. But the model in some senses it's not broken. It needs fixing perhaps, but it certainly needs shifting. And the Chinese state, the Communist Party, has clearly recognized that and is actually trying to change the model. The political economy of that is fascinating to watch, of course. So how successful they will be, we will see. But within that shifting of the model, a lot of emphasis has been put on new sectors, and particularly in the services terrain. So if one looks at the Shanghai Free Trade Zone, for instance, it's all about services and rolling out that kind of model to the rest of the Chinese economy. China is now also negotiating bilateral investment treaties with Europe and the United States, which are potentially quite far-reaching in terms of the shift in China's approach to investment regulation. And that's designed to attract services investment and to reassure the kinds of services investors that they want to attract. And of course, there's a huge amount of competition in the Chinese market. So if one just thinks of the steel industry in South Africa, for instance, and not just South Africa, globally, massive overcapacity in the steel sector, to name just one, with huge implications for us here that have a steel industry, and how do we deal with that? Or in our case, we deal with it by raising import barriers. So what are the implications of this for Africa? Well, it's very clear. Well, we don't know how much there is, but it shows up in increasing outward FDI from China, but the impulse is there, and I think that's the important thing. And that's not going to go away. In fact, it's going to intensify, we would suggest. But what we're also seeing, and again, I think this connects with Deborah's presentation, is a changing composition of outward foreign direct investment, away, relatively speaking, from the big SOEs and towards smaller and medium-sized firms, and particularly in the manufacturing sector. And I think we're just in the early stages of that process. It's quite interesting to think about what the potential is for that process. So therefore, we think the role of state-owned enterprises will probably decline, relatively speaking. Obviously, they're not going to go away. They're still going to invest a lot, but the impulse will move towards these manufacturing middle-sized firms. And therefore less emphasis on resource acquisition, relatively speaking. So manufacturing is rising on the Chinese agenda. And it's a private sector-driven phenomenon primarily. And therefore relatively declining emphasis on the role of policy banks and finance. I was quite struck when Helen, I think you, Deborah, asked her what sort of support did you get. I think you asked in the context of the Ethiopian state, but she didn't mention support from policy banks or Chinese SOEs. In fact, the impression I got from her was that they've succeeded despite the state, by and large, in Ethiopia. Anyway, that might be too strong a conclusion, but that was my impression. So now this is what we were dealing with in the last session. Is Africa the final frontier for export-oriented manufacturing FDI? And I think actually the jury is still out on this question. I didn't elaborate on my views in the previous session because I thought I'll hold it over to now. So why do I say that? Well, firstly, I think, and I've made this point already, there are enduring Chinese advantages. Right? So there's still a huge labor force. The cost structure is relatively high. Productivity is high, but there's a huge investment in infrastructure, logistics, and all of that. It will continue to support the Chinese manufacturing juggernaut, but it's going to move higher up the value chain, and we're already seeing that taking place. But also there are broader Asian advantages. So we're competing, right? We're competing with, for instance, Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and others in East and South Asia. And who knows where India is going to go, whether India really will get its act together in this space or not. But if India does, think of the potential for low-wage, assembly-based manufacturing. So it's not a given that this is just going to come to Africa. And of course, I tried to allude to this in my remarks. There are a range of African challenges, particularly around governance, but not just governance. Also, if you're landlocked, for instance, or you have a small population, you're not going to be able to take advantage of this potential, we would argue. So Deborah's already spoken about the flying geese paradigm. So the question is whether the geese will land in Africa, and then where in Africa will they land? And I think for the low-wage assembly-based manufacturing model, that's largely a function of demographics, which we touched on in the last session. Not only, but largely a function. So just to refresh your memory, this is a chart taken from the UN, basically showing the rise of African populations up till the end of this century, the relative decline in Asia, and of course stagnation elsewhere. So when I put up this slide in Japan, they did not believe me. I have to say, I was quite struck by that. They were not aware of this dynamic. And they all immediately got out their laptops and started looking up the databases just to check that I wasn't trying to sell them some false story. I have to say, this is largely an East African and Nigerian phenomenon. Right? And we need to be clear about that. That's where these growth rates are concentrated. So here's the next slide I wanted to show you. And this is taken from an African Development Bank report. And it's really a heat map. It's showing population densities. Okay? Now, if we look at our part of the world, let's start down here. Very sparse populations. Concentration along the east coast, so KwaZulu-Natal, my home province, does have some manufacturing capacities and some advantages around the port of Durban. But the wage structures, the wage costs in South Africa are roughly equivalent to the Czech Republic. Now, the Czech Republic is hardly going to compete with China in low-wage, assembly-based manufacturing, I would suggest. There's Ethiopia and other parts of East Africa, so that's an important nexus for this kind of manufacturing, and we've heard about that story, and I think that's interesting. It's growing. And then there's West Africa, but particularly Nigeria. And let's just leave North Africa out of the frame for now. That, of course, is the Sahara. So this is why, I said in my remarks that I think we have to think about the geography of this possibility. It is not going everywhere. It's going to be concentrated in particular countries, and particularly those that grasp the governance reform nettle. And I think we should unpack that. What does it mean to attract this kind of manufacturing? What kind of state do you require? Is it hostile to this kind of manufacturing? Is it in favor of it? Is it going to go the extra mile to please multinational investors? A number of countries in this region, I would suggest, are not. In fact, they're going the opposite direction. I don't know about East Africa. Nigeria, I would say, has to be a very difficult environment to do business in. Just to give one example, before the current president came to power, the central bank governor in Nigeria drew up a list of 40 products out of the blue and imposed import restrictions on them. This is the central bank, not even the trade ministry, basically blocked importation of those products. And the companies affected all said, why is my product on this list? Suddenly I can't import it. So that's the kind of arbitrariness in trade policy making that if I were a multinational investor, I would be very concerned about. So I think that's about the governance reform nettle and much more, of course. Secondly, those countries that are favored by geography, and there I mean particularly coastal locations. So for this kind of manufacturing, you need to get your goods to port competitively. Ethiopia is close to Djibouti. It actually doesn't have direct access to the sea, but it is close to Djibouti. But more importantly, it has the resource endowment. So it's fundamentally a low-cost labor story in the Ethiopian case. And what I took from Helen is succeeding despite the obstacles, but also political willingness to back her up when necessary. I was very interested in the question from the gentleman here about the smaller scale companies who don't have Helen's political access. How do you succeed? Even the mayor won't talk to you in Nairobi. Much more difficult, it seems to me. And then, very importantly, they need to welcome foreign direct investment by multinational corporations. Very clearly, Chinese special economic zones could be a key policy tool to facilitate this process. I don't know enough about how they actually operate as to whether that's a viable proposition or not. Okay, so some broader considerations on the Chinese side. What is this going to require? Well, we think it will require actually smarter Chinese diplomacy. And that's quite an interesting thing to think about. Along what lines? So firstly, oriented towards commercial projects, so targeting new sectors, and particularly manufacturing, and putting in, and working more with the Chinese private sector. So how much does the Chinese state, embassy structures particularly, actually work with and support its private sector? Interesting question. I don't really have an answer to that, but that's worth thinking about. But they're going to have to support the private sector more, for sure. And that means rolling out various diplomatic tools. And a lot of those, we think, will focus on the economic rules of the game. And particularly, the first point, putting greater emphasis on good governance in Africa to secure Chinese investments and interests. And actually, I think that's a win-win proposition, by the way. Also, they think it involves promoting trade liberalization. So this export-oriented manufacturing path, you have to be able to import in order to be able to export. How can you import if your imports are blocked, or if they appear on some arbitrary list that the central bank governor drew up? So therefore the Chinese state will have to engage with host governments and promote import liberalization if it wants this path to succeed. And of course securing investments through BITs, bilateral investment treaties. So what's the essence of a BIT? It's to protect a company in the event of an expropriation. Okay? So in the South African case, we're cancelling BITs, by the way. We're taking investor-state dispute settlement off the table, probably for good reasons. Personally, I'm quite sympathetic to that. We can debate it. But in the Namibian case, I'm not so sure that that's a good path for them, by the way, but that's also the route they're going. And the region as a whole, Southern Africa, is going that route too. Now, would my investments as a Chinese investor or anywhere else be secure in Zimbabwe, for instance, without access to investor-state dispute settlement? And I would suggest not, at least as things currently stand. Or in Angola, for that matter. I don't know. So these are hard governance questions we need to ask. But if I was sitting in Beijing looking at this, I would certainly be looking to secure my company's investments through bilateral investment treaties with investor-state dispute settlement, which is the essence of what China, by the way, is negotiating with the US. That's going to be a very demanding bilateral investment treaty negotiation. It is a very demanding one. Okay, and then of course that suggests that the policy of non-interference is going to become increasingly constrained. Right? I think maybe it is already not so much on the table. I don't know. I don't follow these things that closely. But it's certainly going to become more constrained. And then the final point, so this market-seeking investment is there to access essentially the middle-class growth phenomenon, the African middle-class growth phenomenon. But as Chinese investors come into greater contact with those African middle classes, things like human rights agendas, corporate social responsibility, labor rights, the environment, these things matter to African middle classes. So the Chinese government will have to grasp this and engage with it. And I think it already is in a range of different ways. That might, of course, raise challenges back in China, but then Africa's a small fish on the global scale.